Imagine a father holding a blade with a heavy heart, prepared to do the unthinkable, sacrifice his own son. This is Abraham, the man chosen by God to begin a lineage that would change the course of history. On the altar lies Isaac, the son of the promise, unaware of what is happening. But before the blade comes down, something extraordinary happens. This is just one chapter of the incredible journey of Isaac, the link between Abraham and the future of humanity. Today, you will discover how a boy promised by God became an essential patriarch in the divine plan. This is the beginning of Isaac's story, a man who started as the unlikely miracle of an elderly couple and became a key patriarch in the lineage of God's people. Today, we'll explore his incredible journey, from the laughter of his mother to the moment his life itself became a symbol of divine faithfulness. Before we dive into this emotional journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the impactful stories we bring here. And of course, if you're already feeling the power of this story, leave your like right now. It helps us share these messages with even more people. That said, let's dive into today's story. To talk about Isaac, let us revisit the story of his birth. Imagine hearing a voice calling you to the unknown, a voice that defies all logic and asks you to leave everything you know behind. This is exactly what happened to Abraham. In the midst of his comfortable life, in Ur of the Chaldeans, God spoke, "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." This was the beginning of a journey that would not only change Abraham's life, but mark the entire course of human history. Abraham obeyed, even without knowing the final destination. He departed with his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, carrying only the faith that God would fulfill his promise. God told Abraham that he would make him into a great nation, and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. But there was a huge problem. Sarah was barren, and both were advanced in age. To any ordinary person, the promise seemed impossible, but to God, it was merely the start of a grand plan. While Abraham and Sarah struggled to cope with the weight, God renewed his promise time and time again. Imagine the internal battle of this couple, the growing anticipation, the inevitable doubts, and the passing years without any concrete signs. It's easy to relate this experience to our own lives. How often do we receive promises or dreams that seem to drift further away over time? Abraham and Sarah were just like us, full of questions, but holding firmly to faith. As time went on, in a moment of human weakness, Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar. Ishmael was born from this arrangement, but he was not the son of the promise. God made it clear that his covenant would be with the son born to Sarah. This part of the story reminds us that we often try to help God, attempting to take control of the situation. But God's plan doesn't require shortcuts, only trust. Finally, when Abraham was 99 years old and Sarah 90, God appeared again and reaffirmed his promise, changing their names to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude, and Sarah, mother of nations. The impossible was about to happen. When the celestial visitors announced that Sarah would give birth within a year, she laughed, not with joy, but in disbelief. "After I am worn out, will I now have this pleasure?" she asked. How often do we feel like Sarah? We look at our limitations and doubt that something great can come from our lives. But God responded powerfully, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This phrase echoes through the ages, reminding us that God doesn't work within our limitations. He works with his promise. And then the miracle happened. Sarah conceived and gave birth to a son, whom they named Isaac, meaning laughter. The laughter of disbelief turned into laughter of joy. Abraham and Sarah held in their arms the fulfillment of a promise that had seemed unattainable. Isaac was not just a son, he was a symbol of God's faithfulness. The birth of Isaac is a powerful reminder for us today. Even when everything seems lost, when years pass and hope diminishes, God remains faithful. He fulfills his promises at the right time, not ours. And so begins the story of Isaac, the son of the promise, a chapter that teaches us that the impossible becomes possible when God is in control. The arrival of Isaac into the world was not just the fulfillment of a promise, it was living proof that God acts in ways that defy human logic. When Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, a couple who, from a human perspective, had no ability to have children. But God had said it would happen, and it did. Imagine Abraham's emotion as he held Isaac in his arms, the son he had waited decades for. The name Isaac means laughter, and it couldn't have been more fitting. Sarah laughed when she first heard she would give birth, first in disbelief and later in joy. In Genesis 21:6, she says, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." This moment was more than a personal victory. It was a celebration of God's faithfulness. Isaac's laughter was the sound of a fulfilled promise, a reminder that the impossible is just an opportunity for God to display his power. In everyday life, how often do we find ourselves like Sarah? We look at our circumstances and think it's too late for our dreams, that we're too old, too weak, or simply out of time. But Isaac's story shows us that God's timing is not our timing. He is not bound by the barriers we see. His word always comes to pass, even if it seems unlikely or takes time to arrive. Isaac's birth also brought challenges and changes. Ishmael, Abraham's son with Hagar, began mocking Isaac, and Sarah realized that he could not grow up alongside her son. She asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. This was a difficult moment for Abraham, who loved Ishmael. But God assured him that he would also make Ishmael into a great nation, though the primary promise rested with Isaac. This painful separation reminds us that sometimes, to fully live out God's promises, we must leave behind things or people who are no longer part of the plan. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Just as Abraham had to trust that God would take care of Ishmael, we too must believe that God will handle everything we leave in his hands. As Isaac grew, he became a living testament to God's provision. Each step of his childhood was a reaffirmation of God's faithfulness. He was not just Abraham and Sarah's son, he was the embodiment of a divine promise, a constant reminder that God fulfills what he promises. This part of Isaac's story invites us to reflect on our own seasons of waiting. Perhaps you are waiting for something now, a job, healing, or family restoration. Just like Abraham and Sarah, the wait can feel long and full of challenges. But Isaac's birth reminds us that God is never late. He fulfills his promises at the perfect time, and when he acts, the result is always perfect. With Isaac in their arms, Abraham and Sarah were not just celebrating the end of a long wait, they were witnessing the beginning of something much greater. God's promise didn't end with Isaac, it was only just beginning. He was the link that would connect Abraham to future generations, an essential step in God's redemptive plan for all humanity. Thus, the birth of Isaac was not merely a miracle for an elderly couple. It was a landmark in the history of faith, an eternal reminder that God is faithful and never forgets his promises, no matter how improbable they may seem. Imagine the moment when a long-awaited precious promise seems about to be taken from your hands. Abraham, now an elderly man, sees his son Isaac growing up healthy and full of life. The boy is the fulfillment of everything God had promised. And then, one day, God speaks to Abraham again. But this time, God's command is perplexing, almost impossible to comprehend. "Abraham," God calls him. and he promptly responds, "Here I am." Then comes the command, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." This command is the greatest test of faith Abraham has ever faced. God is asking him to give up his own son, the son of the promise, as a sacrifice. It is impossible to imagine the anguish in Abraham's heart as he hears these words. He does not question or argue. He trusts. In Hebrews 11, we are reminded that Abraham believed God could even raise Isaac from the dead if necessary. That is the level of faith he carried, a faith that transcends fear and human understanding. The next morning, without hesitation, Abraham gets up early, prepares the wood for the sacrifice, saddles his donkey, and sets out with Isaac and 2 servants. The journey to Mount Moriah takes 3 days. Imagine the emotional weight of this trip. Every step is a reminder of what is to come. Abraham looks at Isaac, his beloved son, knowing what God has asked, yet he reveals nothing to the boy. When they reach the place God had indicated, Abraham says to the servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Notice the detail, "we will come back." Even in the face of such a difficult command, Abraham still believes that somehow he and Isaac will return together. This is the essence of unshakable faith. Abraham places the wood on Isaac's shoulders and carries the fire and the knife himself. As they climb the mountain, Isaac notices something is missing. "Father?" he asks. "Yes, my son," Abraham responds. "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac's question cuts like a knife through Abraham's heart, but he answers with words that would echo through eternity. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Abraham didn't know how, but he trusted that God would intervene. When they reach the top of the mountain, Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, and binds Isaac. The biblical text does not mention any resistance from Isaac, suggesting his submission to God's plan and his father's will. Abraham then stretches out his hand and takes the knife. At that moment of maximum tension, the angel of the Lord calls out, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. He takes the ram and sacrifices it in place of Isaac. There, Abraham names the place, "The Lord will provide." This name is not just a reminder of what happened there, it is a promise for the future, a declaration that God is faithful and always provides what is needed, even in the most impossible situations. This story is not just about obedience, it is about Abraham's unconditional trust in God's character. He knew that God is good, even when divine plans do not make sense. It is also a foreshadowing of the sacrifice God would make centuries later, when he gave his own son, Jesus Christ, to be the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. For us, Mount Moriah represents those moments when we are called to surrender something precious, to trust God even when everything seems out of control. Perhaps you are facing such a moment now, a loss, a challenge, a difficult decision. The story of Abraham and Isaac reminds us that God is always faithful. He never asks us for something without a greater purpose. Isaac descends the mountain alongside his father, carrying not only the wood that was once on his shoulders, but also a lesson that would shape his life. God provides, always. This pivotal event in Isaac's life would not be the last time he experienced God's faithfulness, but it would be one of the most profound, a lasting reminder that he was part of something far greater than he could ever imagine. After the sacrifice on Mount Moriah, Isaac's life began to take shape, but he still had a crucial role to play in the fulfillment of the divine promise. Isaac needed a wife, someone who would not only share his faith, but also be part of God's plan to build a great nation. And as with everything in Isaac's life, the choice of his wife would be guided by God's hand. Abraham, now advanced in age, knew it was essential to ensure that Isaac married someone from the same people and faith. He didn't want Isaac to marry the women of Canaan, who worshipped other gods. So Abraham called his most trusted servant and gave him a mission to travel to his homeland and find a wife for Isaac. This moment is significant because Abraham knew that God was in control. He instructed his servant with these words, "The Lord, the God of heaven, will send his angel before you so that you can find a wife for my son." This demonstrates Abraham's absolute trust in God's faithfulness, something he had learned through a lifetime of challenges and fulfilled promises. Carrying the weight of this responsibility, the servant traveled to the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia. Upon arriving, he stopped near a well, a place where the city's women would often come to draw water. Knowing the importance of his mission, he prayed a bold and specific prayer. "Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. May it be that when I say to a young woman, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too,' let her be the one you have chosen for Isaac." This prayer teaches us much about trusting God in our decisions. Often we are paralyzed by doubt, but Abraham's servant shows us that we can ask for specific guidance from God and wait for his answer. Before the servant even finished praying, Rebekah appeared. She was beautiful, kind, and most importantly, from Abraham's own family. When the servant asked for water, Rebekah not only gave him a drink, but also offered to draw water for his camels, just as he had prayed. This simple gesture revealed her generous character and willingness to serve, qualities that made her perfect to be Isaac's wife. Immediately, the servant praised God, recognizing that he had found the right woman. He explained his mission to Rebekah's family, and they agreed to let her go. When Rebekah was asked if she was willing to leave, she responded with faith, "I will go." This yes reflects the obedience and courage echoed throughout the Bible, from Abraham to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Upon arriving in Abraham's land, Isaac saw Rebekah from a distance. The Bible describes this moment simply, but its emotional depth is undeniable. Isaac was meditating in the field when he saw the camels approaching. When Rebekah learned that it was him, she got down from her camel and covered herself with a veil. The Bible tells us that Isaac took Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent and made her his wife. He loved her, and she brought him comfort after the death of his mother. This marriage was not just a union between two people, it was the continuation of a promise. Isaac and Rebekah became the pillars of a new generation, the next link in the chain leading to the fulfillment of God's promise of a great nation. This story reminds us that God is deeply involved in the details of our lives. Just as he guided Abraham's servant, he can also guide us in our most important decisions, whether in choosing a partner, seeking purpose, or navigating moments of doubt. When we trust him, things align in ways we could never imagine. For those watching this story today, perhaps you are waiting for something, a relationship, direction, or an answer. The example of Rebekah and Isaac teaches us that God is always at work, even when we cannot see it. He hears our prayers and responds in ways that are both unexpected and extraordinary. After his union with Rebekah, Isaac began to walk his own journey as a patriarch of God's promise. Although his life was marked by God's presence, it was not without challenges. In fact, the conflicts he faced became opportunities to demonstrate his faith and peaceful character. One of Isaac's first challenges occurred during a severe famine in the land. Like his father Abraham, he was tempted to go to Egypt in search of sustenance. But God appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt, live in the land I tell you about." "Stay in this land, and I will be with you and bless you." Isaac obeyed and stayed in the region of Gerar, where God reaffirmed the promise made to Abraham. His descendants would inherit the land and be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Even while obeying God's direction, Isaac faced difficulties. In Gerar, he struggled with insecurity and his own fears. Like his father had done before, he claimed that Rebekah was his sister to protect himself from potential threats. Although this action revealed his human vulnerability, God continued to protect him. When King Abimelech discovered the truth, he ensured Isaac and Rebekah's safety, showing that God cared for Isaac even in his weaknesses. But the challenges did not end there. As Isaac prospered in Gerar, the Philistines began to envy him. God blessed him so abundantly that he became extremely wealthy, with many flocks and servants. This prosperity sparked jealousy, and the Philistines began filling the wells Abraham had dug, an attempt to hinder Isaac's growth. Instead of fighting, Isaac chose to leave peacefully and dig new wells. Each time his servants found water, the Philistines would claim the well, forcing Isaac to move again. This cycle of conflict could have driven Isaac to retaliate, but he chose the path of peace. Finally, after digging a well in a place called Rehoboth, he found a space where no one disputed it. There he declared, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." These conflicts with the Philistines illustrate how Isaac chose to trust in God's providence rather than relying on his own strength. It is a powerful lesson for modern life. How often do we find ourselves in situations where we are provoked or challenged, and our natural reaction is to fight to defend what we believe is ours? Isaac's life reminds us that God is the true provider, and that often peace is more powerful than force. After settling in Rehoboth, Isaac was visited by God. The Lord reaffirmed his promise, saying, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and increase your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." In response, Isaac built an altar and called on the name of the Lord, demonstrating his gratitude and devotion. This experience teaches us that even in times of difficulty and conflict, God never abandons us. He is faithful to fulfill his promises, and when we trust in him, we find peace even in the most challenging situations. Isaac's story in Gerar concludes with a surprising turn of events. King Abimelech, who initially expelled him, returned to make a peace treaty with him. He recognized that God was with Isaac and wanted to ensure good relations. This final act reinforces the truth that when we follow the path of peace and trust in God, even our enemies recognize the divine blessing in our lives. Over the years, Isaac and Rebekah had two sons, Jacob and Esau. From birth, it was evident that these brothers would be different. Esau, the eldest, was a bold and physical man, skilled in hunting. Jacob, on the other hand, was more introspective and preferred staying at home. The Bible describes that Isaac loved Esau because of his hunting skills, while Rebekah favored Jacob. These differences would soon become central to the continuation of God's plan. According to the tradition of the time, the blessing of the firstborn was crucial. This blessing not only granted the eldest son the right to lead the family, but also carried the spiritual promise tied to God's covenant with Abraham. For Isaac, this blessing was meant for Esau, the firstborn, but God had other plans. From the twins' birth, God declared, "The older will serve the younger." This was the divine plan, though it would unfold through a path of deception and human choices. The first turning point came when Esau, famished after a day of hunting, sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew. This impulsive act demonstrated that Esau did not value the spiritual weight of his inheritance. Jacob, on the other hand, showed determination, even if through questionable means. Years later, with Isaac now old and blind, the time came to bestow the blessing of the firstborn. Isaac asked Esau to hunt and prepare a special meal so he could bless him before his death. While Esau went out to fulfill the task, Rebekah, remembering God's prophecy, conspired with Jacob to ensure he received the blessing. Disguised as Esau, Jacob presented himself to his father with food prepared by Rebekah. Although suspicious, Isaac was convinced and gave Jacob the blessing intended for the firstborn. This blessing included prosperity, dominion, and divine protection. When Esau returned and discovered the deception, he was furious and vowed to kill Jacob, forcing him to flee. Though the path to the blessing was marked by deceit, God used these circumstances to fulfill his greater plan. Jacob, not Esau, would be the bearer of the promise. This teaches us that even when people make wrong choices or act with questionable motives, God remains sovereign and can redeem any situation to accomplish his purposes. For Isaac, this episode was not just a family matter, it was a milestone in God's divine plan. His blessing, even given under deceptive circumstances, was key to the continuation of God's promise to Abraham. Jacob would become Israel, the father of 12 tribes, and through his lineage, the Savior of the world, Jesus Christ, would come. This story also challenges us to reflect on the value we place on God's blessings in our own lives. Do we, like Esau, sometimes disregard spiritual things in exchange for momentary gratification? Or are we, like Jacob, determined to claim what God has promised, even if through flawed means? Isaac's life shows us that, despite human failures, God is faithful and will continue to fulfill his promises. At the end of his life, Isaac saw his two sons take separate paths, but also trusted that God's plan was unfolding. His blessing was not just for Jacob or Esau, but for all future generations who would be impacted by the promise of redemption. Isaac's story reminds us that God's plans are bigger than our actions or mistakes, and his promises endure, bringing hope and purpose to all who trust in him. Isaac's life was not marked by grand deeds or epic battles like those of other biblical figures. Nevertheless, his story is deeply significant because it reflects God's faithfulness and the importance of walking in obedience. He was the link that kept the divine promise alive between Abraham and Jacob, showing that God not only makes promises, but also fulfills them in every generation. Isaac's birth reminds us that God makes the impossible possible. His arrival in the world was a miracle that defied human limitations, proving that God is not bound by time or circumstances. How often do we feel like Sarah, laughing at the thought that something great could happen in our lives? Isaac's story encourages us to trust in God's timing and power, even when everything seems unlikely. The sacrifice on Mount Moriah teaches us an even deeper lesson about obedience and trust. Abraham was willing to give up what was most precious to him because he trusted fully in God's character. For Isaac, this event was a demonstration of divine love and provision, an eternal reminder that God always provides. This challenges us to reflect. Are we willing to place our own promises in God's hands, trusting that He knows what is best? Isaac's adult life, with its conflicts and peaceful resolutions, is also a powerful example. He faced opposition but chose peace over war, trust over anxiety. This shows us that even amidst challenges, it is possible to live with a heart confident in God. Isaac's story invites us to reconsider how we respond to daily conflicts. Are we fighting for things that God has already set aside for us? Finally, Isaac's blessing of Jacob and Esau teaches us that God's plan is greater than our mistakes. Even in the midst of deception and human imperfection, God continued to guide history to fulfill His purposes. This is a powerful reminder that God uses ordinary people with flaws and fears to accomplish extraordinary works. When we look at Isaac's life as a whole, we see a man of faith and patience. He was not perfect, but he walked under God's grace and guidance. His life challenges us to reflect on our own journey. Are we trusting in God's plan, even when we don't understand it? Are we living in a way that ensures we are a link to the next generation, keeping God's promise alive? Like Isaac, we are all part of a greater story. His life reminds us that no matter how ordinary or challenging our journeys may seem, God is always working behind the scenes to fulfill His promises. God's invitation to us is the same, to trust, obey, and allow Him to write our story. Share in the comments if you already knew Isaac's story and how it touched your heart. May God bless you abundantly. See you in the next video.